not too long ago.
This is the penis envy theory. Right. Now, Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, what he actually did is he looked at this Freudian theory, the penis envy theory in psychology, and he looked at Einstein's general relativity, and he said, this is pseudoscience and this is science. And why? Because the penis envy theory, no data can contradict it. But the general relativity, you know, in the experiment when they're waiting for an eclipse, if that experiment went wrong, Einstein's theory would be falsified. This same guy, Karl Popper, who was an atheist, he said Darwinian evolution is a pseudoscience because it's not falsifiable.
Not too long ago.
Yeah, I think before I answer the question, let me just repeat for everybody the broader outline of what our approach is. So the first thing is, we would accept Darwinian evolution as a valid scientific theory, right? We'd accept it as valid science. We just wouldn't accept it to be true literally. So that's the first point, which is very important.
Not too long ago.
Went wrong, Einstein's theory would be falsified. This same guy, Karl Popper, who was an atheist, he said Darwinian evolution is a pseudoscience because it's not falsifiable.
We would accept Darwinian evolution as a valid scientific theory, right? We'd accept it as valid science. We just wouldn't accept it to be true literally.
I don't care if Monday's blue, Tuesday's grey and Wednesday too. Thursday, I don't care about you. It's Friday, I'm in love.
When it comes to human chimpanzee ancestry, this is still based upon homology. Now, homology is the assumption that similarities, whether at genetic or anatomical or biochemical level, are due to common ancestry. That is an assumption.
A few moments later.
You were saying that it was based on an assumption of homology, yeah? And that's false. That's not true at all. Okay?
Okay.
Let me tell you why.
So human
that's
chimpanzee ancestry is not based on homology.
It's not based on an assumption of homology.
So-
it's based off of evidence.
Sure. So tell me this.
We don't start with the assumption of homology and then conclude homology. Of course not.
Okay. Homology is an assumption.
Okay. No, it isn't.
Comparison
Right.
of
So when
genomes
you
is homology.
Okay. No, it's not.
Two very boring minutes later.
Is it homologous or is it not homologous? It's not decided ahead of time.
Yeah,
Now,
but the
of
assumption
course-
is there though.
Okay, yes, the assumption is there. I don't disagree with that.
So you
But-
previously said it's a conclusion on assumption.
No, what I'm saying is, you must...
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Homology is the assumption that similarities, whether genetic, anatomical, or biochemical, are due to common ancestry. From that, Subboor concludes homology alone is what makes scientists believe in common ancestry. And that is an assumption. Of course, that's false. There are much more scientists consider other than homology to conclude common ancestry.
So let's go. Let's take that one. That one is right from...
What is that?
That's from 1 million years old.
Oh, it's like this. So these are the eyes. Well,
right,
yeah.
That's right.
So I suppose it would probably go over here because the where the brow comes up is more
Perfect.
similar to this one.
You got it. Careful now.
Sorry.
They may not be the real fossils, but there's only one copy in the United States, so we don't want to break it.
I'm probably going to put this one here, I think.
Now, you got the order exactly correct, because what we find is that's the closest to the top. Oh, you got one out of order, the Kenyan one. So that's just,
Is that right there?
that's good, that's good. And then we get back to 4.5 million years ago. Now remember, I talked about one valley in Africa, one stack of rocks. Now, according to the idea that humans haven't changed and that we should find humans all the way back, now we've got a problem in terms of the evidence because we don't find any of those guys down in the early records. And we don't find any of these in the later records. So it looks like that model, where it should be all humans all the way back, fails.
It says a lot. I mean, I understand what your logic is. I understand how you got here. I haven't seen a case of natural selection making an organism change from one species to another species.
Neither have I, because we don't live long enough, bro.
One second. I think that's an...
We don't live long enough. The neat thing we've got in this fossil record is nearly it's not conjecture, it's evidence and reason. We have almost a kilometer of rocks, over a kilometer, and we can actually ask the question, what do we see when we go back through time?
So in this valley...
And this is what we see.
Now, human beings and chimpanzees, we have some similar traits physically. Because of this, Darwinists say, look at this physical trait, look at this physical trait, therefore they have a common ancestor. Well, this is an assumption, and this assumption is known as homology.
Subboor says because of this homology, Darwinists say therefore they have common ancestry. That's an error. It's not just because of homology. There is also a qualified, quantified, and comparative analysis, like being time consistent, not time crossing, gradual similarities, comparative analysis between species, and other. This additional data makes common ancestry not an assumption, but an informed position based on hard evidence. In the case of humans and chimps, we are certain there is common ancestry, and certainly is not an assumption. The fossil record alone is conclusive. We find time-consistent fossils, not time-crossing, gradual from a chimp kind of creature to humans. This data can only be interpreted common ancestry, or a cosmic prank of outrageous proportions from God or other alien intelligent species that prank humans to believe common ancestry is true. And if this is the case, will Subboor Ahmed be equally skeptical across the board, or he is only skeptical when it comes to evolution? Subboor grossly misrepresents evolutionary biology by implying scientists make silly logical errors, like the questionable cause logical fallacy. Correlation is not causation, in other words, exposing his own naivete and contempt for science. He shows almost bigotry against science, assuming the scientific method is so flawed and scientists are so naive. No wonder, then, he puts the Quran over the investigative ability of science. Science is changing, he says, and doesn't deal with absolute truth. There are also interpretations of science and paradigm shifts, so how it can disprove Islam? A misrepresentation of the burden of proof and an overstatement of the epistemic value of revelations and dogma.
And just of course, also science itself is not a static body of knowledge. It's constantly developing and changing. And as you referenced in the book with Thomas Kuhn, the American philosopher of science, who talked about paradigm shifts. Science itself goes through revolutions in its worldview. So to hitch one's understanding to a particular view of science now may be out of date, even in a year's time or 50 years' time. So that's another complexity on this as well.
Yeah. And I think
my parents are not Muslim. My wife is in the audience and she...
That is the moronic argument Hamza Tzortzis first put forward, that when science contradicts the Quran, we trust the Quran because science is changing. Yeah, let me tell you what's the problem with that, Paul. It's a non sequitur. Just because science doesn't deal with absolute truth, that doesn't mean it cannot judge the Quran. Okay, it's a non sequitur, my friend. Just because science doesn't deal with absolute truth, that doesn't mean it cannot destroy Islam. When it comes to truth, science is the Mount Everest, Islam is an ant. Okay, just because the Mount Everest is not absolutely big, that doesn't mean it cannot crush an ant.
You can pray for your parents. I can't pray for my dad when he died.
Science can make Islam highly unlikely and therefore not reasonable to believe. Can Islamic theology with the judgment myths and eternal punishment work without being reasonable to believe? And the answer is no. Therefore, science can in fact conclusively and absolutely destroy Islam. Not that it needed to, because the burden of proof is on Islam to show itself and not science to disprove it. The inevitable state of things is that absolute truth cannot be gained, not from science and certainly not from religion. So why Subboor demands the unreasonable absolute truth to accept evolution? Because Subboor cares to protect his dogma and doesn't care for the truth. So hides behind uncertainty to avoid uncomfortable evidence that will compromise his blind faith. In other words, Subboor and his friends made gullibility and blind faith a science. They sacrifice common good for Islamic supremacy. For the rest of us that still care about humanity and think humanity is worth preserving over masturbating in our psychotic delusions, we use effective reasoning to establish probabilities. Reasonable to believe equals level of claim plus level of conviction this claim demands divided by the evidence. Level of claim is how significant is the claim. Example, I have a dragon in my basement is more significant than I have a car in my basement. Level of conviction is how demanding is this claim. Asking people to give up their holiday is more demanding than asking people to give up their children. Okay, so, and divide all that with the evidence. Evolution is reasonable to believe, therefore, Islam is not reasonable to believe. The end. The rest are for the philosophy classrooms to train our mind. It's not for practical application. Subboor puts the facade of a skeptic, but he is an apologist. The difference between a skeptic and an apologist, the skeptic follows the evidence where they lead and cares for truth. An apologist tunes the evidence to fit his dogma and cares for the supremacy of his dogma over truth. The apologist will contradict himself, as we saw in the beginning of this video, exactly because he doesn't care about truth. If in a debate, while communicating Islamic supremacy, evolution might be science. In another debate, while communicating Islamic supremacy, evolution might be pseudoscience. Who cares? Okay, science, not science, evolution, whatever. As long as we communicate Islamic supremacy. If the goal is truth, it matters whether evolution is science or not. If the goal is Islamic supremacy, who cares if evolution is true or not? Coming up, I will give conclusive evidence how Subboor, in fact, tunes his skepticism to always conclude Islam is true.
So in the beginning of my video, I said this is the way I am defining a fact for the purposes of this discussion. And
what
I
is
said,
that definition?
Yeah. And that's the definition I used. Which
what is it?
Which I said was something absolute, something that's not going to change, and something that can't be revised.
When it comes to evolution, Subboor demands something absolute as a fact. In other words, something that cannot be obtained. Not even the earth is a sphere is an absolute. Nothing is an absolute. Except direct contradictions and things like that. In other words, Subboor, to accept evolution, you need us to provide you a square circle. To accept it, Anything less than that is unreasonable. In other words, your statement is literally, I will never accept evolution unless you provide me something that cannot be provided by definition. That of a skeptic, when it comes to evolution, Subboor. You are that of a skeptic. I mean, not even Michael Shermer of the Skeptic magazine is such of a skeptic. So much skepticism, eh? You are so peculiar. What's the word?
Now, what's the criteria to test whether something is or is not a genuine prophecy? I want to ask you that. How would you discern the truth from falsehood?
You'd use empirical evidence.
Exactly, you would use empirical evidence. Something verifiable, something falsifiable, and something precise.
Now when it comes to demonstrate Islamic prophecies, in other words, to show the truth supposedly of Islam, a fact became something verifiable, something falsifiable, and something precise, eh? Subboor tunes his skepticism to always conclude Islam is true. Overstating reason and evidence when it fits his argument, understating reason and evidence when it doesn't fit his argument, or destroy completely the foundations of reason and evidence when his argument is hopeless. This is how Subboor and his fellow cultists sacrifice in the altar of Islamic supremacy truth, the same way they sacrificed morality, reason, etc.
And has a qalb, a heart, has an aql, and the intellect is a function of the heart in the Islamic tradition, and it has a fitrah, and the fitrah is clouded. And within the fitrah, the innate disposition, there are forms of proto-knowledge in the Islamic tradition that God is a reality and that He's worthy of worship, but that clouded. So it could be that a sound, rational argument, philosophical argument, whatever, can uncloud your innate disposition to awaken the truth within, or it could be something else, or it could be a combination of things. So when you ask me, it needs to be demonstrated, well, I need to find out who you are, because I don't know where your cloud is. Maybe you need a rational argument. Maybe you need a good hug. Maybe you need some love.
Now you don't need something absolute, something that will not change, and something that cannot be revised. In other words, evidence that cannot even obtain by definition. Now just a hug is enough. How about a kiss? Is a kiss enough for you to accept Islam?
Because the reason for your disbelief is arrogance, right? To find out who you are, because I don't know where your cloud is. Maybe you need a rational argument. Maybe you need a good hug. Maybe you need some love. Maybe you need some really strong Quranic verses to wake you up. Because the reason for your disbelief to find out who you are, because I don't know where your cloud is. Maybe you need a rational argument. Maybe you need a good hug.
So, the epistemology Subboor Ahmed and his friends want us to accept is a thick head when it comes to accept evolution. In other words, cannot be convinced by anything. When it comes to accept Islam, be gullible like the hugging bears. What was the name of the hug bears? That is the epistemology you want us to accept. But Richard Dawkins misleads people in epistemology because of scientism. Cuckoo.
And this is not based upon our own whims and desires. This is actually based upon people of knowledge, discussions with people of knowledge. This is based upon the Quran, this is based upon the Sunnah, and this is something which should be obvious, but it's not really that obvious. Okay, I want full attention and full participation. These are aspects of Islam that we all believe in and accept. What if I come along and I tell you something? There is a Sahih narration of the Prophet ﷺ that you have to wear a yellow hat on Sundays. Hypothetically. Raise your hand if you're going to wear a yellow hat on Sundays. Why? Because the Prophet said so. Whether you understand it or not, you do understand he's a messenger. Likewise, there is a Muslim who is looking at the world through lenses, green lenses, and he's looking at the world as green. And there is a non-Muslim who is looking at the world through red lenses. So what's happening in the conversation is the Muslim is saying, this is green, this is green, this is green. The non-Muslim is saying, this is red, this is red, this is red. Why is that? The reason is, this is the case is because the Muslim is looking at the world through the lenses of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. He believes that this man called Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam is the final messenger of God. Therefore whatever he says is true.
Evolution, and more specifically, I want to ask you, how certain are we that we have the same ancestors as present day, let's say, chimps?
Notice Mohammed Hijab asked, how certain are we that we evolved from apes?
Okay, brilliant question. All I'm going to do in this show, inshallah, God willing, is show the popular narrative, which is, it is as certain as planetary motion, as certain as the planets going around the sun, that we are certain this has happened, because this is the sort of certainty that Darwinists speak with.
Okay.
And I'm going to show in the...
Are you challenging that certainty?
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm going to show the academics, not me, say it is based on a probabilistic framework, which has multiple assumptions which are being challenged, and its core concepts are disputable.
So are you saying that what's happening on a popular level is completely different from what's going on in the academic world?
Absolutely, and this is not just something which I'm pointing out, this is something that even the British government understands, that the academia is, what's known in academia hasn't filtered down to the general masses, which is why they run projects to narrow the gap.
Right.
But what I would say, when it comes to Darwin's particular theory,
yeah.
Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker says, Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. Before Darwin, it could have been tenable to be an atheist, but he allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. So because of that, we've got a deliberate campaign by humanists, by atheists, by Darwinists, to miseducate the public on this particular issue.
Yeah, Subboor, we will see who is miseducating the public right about now.
Sounds quite conspiratorial, Subboor. I mean,
it does.
I mean, is it just what you're saying, or is there some people from like an academic perspective that have also made the same kind of claim?
Well, what you'll find, and this is very, very interesting, is that mainstream secular academics who are themselves
like who? Like,
atheists, for example, James Shapiro, he is a Cambridge-educated evolutionary biologist at the University of Chicago.
Right.
Shapiro is not a promoter of the classical modern neo-Darwinian model of evolution. Rather, he believes that in a sense, biological organisms are programmed to evolve. That programming, he believes, ultimately did arise through Darwinian processes, unguided mutations preserved by natural selection. But he believes that once that programming was in place, it fostered much of the rest of the evolution of both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. James Shapiro is one of those scientists who think that evolutionary theory is due for a paradigm shift. His shtick is that mutations often involve genome rearrangements and that reorganization of the genome may be a sort of natural genetic engineering that cells use to direct evolution.
Shapiro believes humans evolved from a common ancestor with apes, and he believes in the basic principles of evolution. He just doubts the classical neo-Darwinian mechanism and proposes a new biological mechanism of genetic engineering, making much of the work.
Lynn Margulis, she's again an atheist evolutionary biologist. Her end symbiotic theory is taught in every single university.
Did she get a prize of some sort?
She did. She won the National Medal of Science, and Bill Clinton gave that to her. So again, she's an atheist. She called it an Anglo-Saxon sect.
Right.
And Lynn Margulis says that history will ultimately judge neo-Darwinism as a minor 20th century religious sect within the sprawling religious persuasion of Anglo-Saxon biology. Proponents of the standard theory, she says, wallow in their zoological, capitalistic, competitive cost-benefit interpretation of Darwin, having mistaken him. Neo-Darwinism, which insists on the slow accrual of mutations, is in a complete funk. These quotes are certainly hilarious. However, they cannot support Dr. Behe's contention that evolution is in trouble, since Dr. Margulis has said it isn't in trouble. The religious sect line comes from American zoologist, and it is basically an argument for a particular philosophical view. It's sort of along the lines of holistic versus reductionist. But it's mostly not about facts per se, and it claims to return towards Darwin's original intentions. The line wallow in their zoological, capitalistic, competitive cost-benefit interpretation of Darwin, having mistaken him. She attacks cost-benefit analysis, so I assume this quote is another sally in the same battle. The bit about neo-Darwinism, in a complete funk, refers specifically to the evolution of certain features of eukaryotes and has nothing at all to do with evolution in general. Worse, the line refers to the theory of evolution as it was before everyone decided that Dr. Margulis's theory was right. Since all textbooks now teach her explanation for chloroplasts and mitochondria, the funk is now ancient history. Basically, the quote shows her throwing rocks at people who opposed her on a specific topic of debate. Both sides of the debate called themselves Darwinist. Margulis saw symbiogenesis, the development of new organisms, organelles, and so forth from the merging of two separate organisms, as a fundamental factor in creating genetic variation. More so than mutation, and as a primary force in evolution. In general, and in contrast to neo-Darwinism, Margulis holds that life did not take over the globe by combat, but by networking, in other words, more by cooperation than via Darwinian competition.
Okay, let's get straight into the question I posed to you in the beginning of this session. We talked about certainty in terms of evolutionary theory. You're saying it's not as certain as evolutionists, or let's say even popular atheists, are making it out to be. So what is your evidence of that?
Okay. All of the people I'm going to reference in this video are people that you can go check up, learn, and you can actually find out that what I'm saying is based on what they're saying.
Yeah, we just did that, and what they say is not what you are saying, Subboor. They say evolution is a fact. We just need to revise the strict neo-Darwinian mechanism. You imply evolution is disputed in a level that makes intelligent design probable, which is simply not true. Where they disagree with neo-Darwinists is on the narrative of competition being the exclusive force behind natural selection, and they add networking. So, Subboor, to conclude, you misrepresent the scientists you quote, pretending that they imply that humans haven't evolved from apes, when that is not what they say. You cannot decide whether evolution is science or not, and you change your narrative. Keep changing your narrative. It's not like you did an error. In 2017, you said it's a pseudoscience. In 2021, you said it's an actual science. Now, you say it's a pseudoscience. So, you cannot decide, and you contradict yourself directly, and you change your narrative in relation to what audience you are addressing and what you want to do every time. You are being arrogant, and you make fun of people in things that you are wrong. Like, for example, that only homology is the reason why scientists conclude common ancestry. Making a mockery of science in this way, okay, implying that scientists are that naive and they make silly logical errors, and evolutionary biology is flawed in such extent. You don't understand epistemology when you imply that revelations are more reliable than science when it comes to truth. At the same time, you admit blind faith, and you go into classrooms and teach students blind faith. You pretend others overstate the truth-bearing ability of science, when in fact you understate the truth-bearing ability of science, Subboor. You made blind faith a science by tuning your skepticism and inventing all these rhetorical and pseudo-philosophical ways to pretend blind faith is justifiable, calling that the philosophy of science, when you misrepresent, in fact, the philosophy of science, while pretending it says something that it doesn't say.
It's pretty close. It's pretty close. I know the essence. I think we can all agree, Cam Brady, he's a mess. All I know. When it comes to jobs for my district, Martin Huggins doesn't dance. He rolls up his sleeves, puts his sandwich in his lunch pail, and brings jobs to the Tar Heel State. Yes!
What the hell?
Yeah! Let's bring back corporations to North Carolina. Let's clean up D.C. and bring your brooms because it's a mess.
There was a clear winner in the first debate. Marty Huggins simply electrified.
2 hours ago, distant Brussels was